Hi, everyone. We'd like to get started. We're running a bit behind schedule already, but that's okay. We have still have a full hour together. In this session, we're focusing on safeguarding the rights of Indigenous peoples and where investors fit in that. I think it's very exciting that this topic is being added to the PRI conversation this year because it's one of the most critical human rights due diligence issues that investors and companies face. Before we begin, I wanted before we go into the conversation, I wanted to start with a land acknowledgement for the people whose traditional territories we are on today during this session. I should say that my name is Delaney. I'm with Share, based in Toronto, and Toronto is a shared land between a number of First Peoples. It's at a central point in the Great Lakes, and it was shared by, and still is today, the Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, Petun, and Haudenosaunee peoples, and now there's many other immigrants from other lands that are living in that land. San Francisco is on the territory of the Ohlone people, who before colonization lived all along the coast from San Francisco down to Big Sur. And when the Spanish arrived, were enslaved and forced to change their customs, forced to flee, and conceal their identity in order to protect themselves. The Ohlone have never, since even after the United States was established, have never received federal recognition. So they are one of many First Peoples that lack a protected land base and lack recognition of their rights, of their identity, culture by their state, and under which they now live. Nevertheless, you can still find much of presence of the Ohlone people in San Francisco, not least people themselves, but then also there's hillsides in San Francisco that are actually created by shell mounds, which were burial sites in which people would be buried after death and then covered over with shells, and how over time those have grown to be hills around the Bay Area. And in fact, the Ohlone are also working to gain recognition still and to reclaim and rebury many of their people who are actually thousands of people who are currently in museums and universities in the United States. So with that place-based recognition, I wanted to introduce our panelist. We have Carla Fredericks, who's the director of the American Indian Law Clinic at the University of Colorado. Janina, Gawler, the vice president for the Americas, Community and Social Performance at Rio Tinto, who is also based in Canada. Tim Goodman, the director for corporate engagement at Hermes, and Carole Laible, CEO for Domini Impact Investment, who all have different perspectives and interesting takes on this issue. And I guess one other point of introduction, I wanted to share how we at Share are approaching the issue of Indigenous rights, and I think it provides a useful frame to engage in conversation with others. Canada had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which produced a report in 2015 that was looking at the historic impacts on Indigenous peoples of colonization of the residential school system and how that has carried through to the present day. And what was particularly useful about that report is that they issued 94 calls to action for all different parts of society, from universities to healthcare systems to sports teams to government, and they included a call to action to business. So I wanted to read that call to action because I think it frames useful approach for many places and people working in this area. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada calls on the corporate sector in Canada to adopt the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a reconciliation framework and to apply its principles, norms, and standards to the corporate policy and core operational activities involving Indigenous peoples and their land and resources. This would include, but not be limited to, the following. 1, commitment to meaningful consultation, building respectful relationships, and attaining the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples before proceeding with economic development projects. 2, ensuring that Aboriginal peoples have equitable access to jobs, training, and educational opportunities in the corporate sector, and that Aboriginal communities gain long-term sustainable benefits from economic development projects. And 3, provide education for management and staff on the history of Aboriginal peoples, including the history and legacy of residential schools, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, treaties and Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law, and the Indigenous government relationship. This will require skills-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism. So right there, those are 3 key points of action that the corporate sector, that investment institutions can take in order to align themselves and do their own due diligence on Indigenous rights. So with that, I wanted to turn over to the panelists to hear a bit about what they're doing. And so we've decided to start with some case studies and examples from the panelists. So if we could first go to Carole, and you could talk a bit about how Domini is using its role as an investor to safeguard Indigenous rights.
I think, no, I'm working. Okay, great. Well, thank you, everybody. Domini uses its role as an investor to influence corporations on critical matters, certainly one of which we consider is the rights of Indigenous people. And to do so, we have 3 tools in our toolkit. The first and very important one is applying standards in our investment process. The second is engaging with corporations seeking to influence change. And the third is investing in healthy, vibrant communities. To do that work, which we work in all 3 of those areas, we've created what we refer to as our impact investment standards. That was created in 2005. It's been very durable. But its goal is to provide complete transparency to our investors in the work that we're doing when we say applying social and environmental standards. But they also serve as the backbone for all of the research that we do on an investment level. And they have 2 overarching goals: ecological sustainability and universal human dignity. So, based on Delaney's opening remarks, I think you can clearly understand how those 2 goals tie back to the rights of Indigenous people. We think it's important when we're evaluating corporate behavior with its local community. And we do that for 2 reasons. The first is that we respect the rights of Indigenous people. And the second is, as investors, we understand that when corporations don't pay attention to these things, these confrontations lead to very damaging results for the corporate reputation. So, we recognize that companies are increasingly operating across the global community. They're working within a variety of legal systems and situations. But we believe that they have a responsibility to ensure that human rights norms are upheld, even when that may be lower, even then that may be a higher standard than the local law that they're operating within. And we're seeking to invest in those companies that can really understand and appreciate the complexity of those relationships with their community, local, national, and global politics. We are a firm believer that what is good for people and good for the planet is often good for business. So they're very closely tied. And we're looking for companies that make a concerted effort to confront these issues in a transparent and ethical manner. By doing so, it's good for the corporations because we see that they can avoid public controversy and potential liability. But as corporations, they can also add value, making a difference in the societies within which they operate, building a strong foundation for the individuals of that society, but also for the very company itself. So our impact investment standards go into a lot of detail. It's about a 40-page document, and there are several themes that really tie back to the support of the rights of Indigenous people and really lead us to see companies that recognize, support, and take concrete actions in these areas. They include the endorsement of international norms, the protection of human rights, and the respect for Indigenous people and local cultures. Those confrontations by large faceless corporations against communities that have been entrenched and have rights can be avoided. Corporations that come in and show sensitivity to the culture of those around them will prosper over the long run as a result of those efforts. We also seek anti-bribery and anti-corruption, recognizing that bribery and corruption deteriorates the very fabric of freedom and practices. So we seek companies that have strong ethics, anti-bribery, and anti-money laundering programs. Under our ecosystems theme, we do recognize that pollution control and abatement is important because corporations at a minimum have an obligation to create no substantial harm done by its operations as well as its supply chain, and that often affects its local community. And we evaluate long-term sustainability because we recognize that the behavior of corporations often affects those communities that were least responsible for causing the issues, such as climate change. So these are critical considerations for the communities that depend on their surrounding environments, and we incorporate them into our investment. We recognize that the value of diversity that Indigenous people brings is incalculable, and the loss of these people is irretrievable. The loss of that diversity is irretrievable. So we seek to invest in corporations that help preserve these very unique cultural riches rather than destroy it in pursuit of short-term profits.
Thanks. And then over to Janina, who actually, I think that's a nice transition because your role is in avoiding these impacts and making sure that the company that you work with has positive relationships with communities. So could you give an example of how that operates in your engagement with Indigenous peoples and how the significance of it for the social license to operate?
Thank you very much. So just responding to what Carole set out in terms of looking at policy and then standards. I'm responsible for communities and social performance, and we have social performance because it has an element of the standards included in it. And across our operations, universally, so we're a global company working in 32 countries, in Canada, the US, Africa, Mongolia and Australia primarily, but a number of other operations in terms of mining and metals universally. Across all of our operations, we expect our standards to be addressed, and that includes recognition of the rights of Indigenous people through the recognition of UNDRIP. Free, prior and informed consent is a requirement. If we're a member of the International Council of Mining and Metals, we are required to demonstrate that we are respecting and recognising the rights of Indigenous people where we work. So I thought looking at the policy framework, we have those in place, and then how do you actually see that they are working? And I think if I look at a couple of case studies, I'll reflect on one in the Iron Ore province in Western Australia and briefly in Diavik. So we've been working in recognition of Indigenous rights for a period of time, particularly in Australia, where we started very strongly at a time when the mythology of terra nullius was swept aside by a decision that recognised native title had been in place from settlement right through to the present day. And many mining companies stood aside from that and fought it, but Rio was very fortunate. We had a strong leader and a strong board, and they embraced it and recognised that we had to find a way forward. and that was in partnership with Indigenous people. So our policy framework has a respect, recognition and now reconciliation framework. How does that look when we're working with agreements on the ground? I led the negotiation on 10 engagements across 10 traditional owner groups, native title groups in the Pilbara, about 1,000 kilometres, 1,500 kilometres north of Perth. It's an iron ore province that has been in place for more than nearly 50 years and will go on for another 50 years. In the first iteration, Indigenous people were not included. And when the rights of Indigenous people were recognised in the High Court, the business stepped forward and started a process of partnering using legal frameworks, but they are now recognised in the federal law, whereby our arrangements are absolutely binding on the company and it's systemic. So it doesn't rely on a particular leader, it's absolutely embedded in the company right through its operations. We expect everybody in our business operating in that iron ore province to undertake cultural awareness training. They have to do that every 3 years. Participation in land clearance. We'll have a new mine opening in the iron ore area every year for the next few years because we're increasing our growth in the iron ore industry. And that requires every area of the land to be looked at by traditional people, by Indigenous people. They identify areas that need to be protected, they identify the cultural heritage, and that process is absolutely built into our standards of operation. You cannot take a bulldozer out onto the land until that's been cleared and signed off, and if it hasn't been cleared and signed off, you are in breach. So that requires then the business to be absolutely integrated with the local native title owners. We have a strong governance framework with each of those mining operations, and there is additional requirements on employment and business, so that must be so people must be included in our businesses and be part of the operation. So that series of standards is audited every 3 years as part of a reporting process, and we have a regional framework. So that didn't take, it took some years to put that in place. It was about 3 years, and I think the business needed to give us the space to be able to do that. So it's one thing to have the policy, it's actually the commitment of the business to ensure that that's implemented. If I reflect on our experiences in the Divik area, which is in the Northwest Territories of Canada, in the pristine tundra area, we have a diamond mine in the middle of a lake. The 5 Indigenous groups, First Nations and Métis, are partners in that process. They are benefits of the concession rights, and they absolutely insisted on strong controls in traditional knowledge. So there's a panel that is participant, first of all, in the arrangements for getting the project in the early 2000s. It's been in operation for a number of years. We have another 5 years of that plant operating. But the traditional traditional people are involved in employment, about 25% of the workforce, and more than $1 billion worth of direct contracting with those traditional businesses that provide services for ice roads and provision of logistics and so on right across the business operation over the last 10 years. So it's looking at the business in terms of how reconciliation, how free, prior and informed consent has been addressed at the beginning of the process right through the operation and then coming into closure that I think demonstrates the credibility of the policy framework that you might have.
Thank you, Janina. And that's interesting because a number of the things that you mentioned there around partnerships, cultural awareness, respect and recognition of rights is the same points as are raised by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So that is, then that's actually the what Share has been focusing our engagement on, is talking to companies about whether and how they're implementing that. And Tim, you've also been leading some engagements around Indigenous rights, and I was wondering if you could talk a bit, give an example and talk a bit about that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Delaney. I will do that, Delaney, but I was going to tell a little story first, and it's not about cobalt, but it is about the iPhone battery that I had replaced in the Apple store this week, because it's much cheaper here than in the UK, and you don't have to queue, and it all worked very well. But you have to sign your life away, and you get this great big disclaimer, and you have to press on your iPhone before they change your battery. And you scroll through all this, and you don't read it, and then you just say, I agree. And that's Apple apparently getting your free, prior and informed consent to what they're doing with your battery and the battery replacement. And I think much of our discussion on Indigenous people's rights is all about the failure of that free, prior and informed consent process. And it doesn't really matter to me if I screw up my battery replacement or they damage my phone. You know, that's not my heritage, that's not my human rights, you know, but it is with Indigenous peoples. And I think we have to be hugely respectful of investors about that process, and we have to hold companies to account around that process. And I think I can probably mention one experience, and it's quite a famous experience, more in relation to climate change. But Shell, when it was pitching to investors about the beauty of its Arctic drilling program in Alaska, actually invited ourselves and a number of other investors to Barrow to explain what a great idea it is, and introduced us. And to their credit, before we got to Barrow, we had half a day of cultural awareness training, which was fascinating. As the more that I get into the subject, the more I realise how complicated and difficult it is, and how little I know, and one has to be hugely humble. And they explained that the affected tribes in Barrow had kind of a tribal hierarchy, a political hierarchy, and indeed an economic hierarchy. And we met and discussed Shell's proposed developments with representatives of that hierarchy. And of course, all the people in the room seemed pretty supportive of what Shell was doing, and I probably not hugely surprising. And we contacted First Peoples Worldwide, who explained actually that there were plenty of people in Barrow, also in leadership positions within the community in those different tangents, who were far less supportive. Of course, when we didn't get very far with the discussions around them, with their concerns, before Shell pulled the plug. But it was a profound, you have to experience it to learn it. It's fine having people explain the complexities and the difficulties of getting to FPIC and the Indigenous people's ways of living and working. But until you actually...
Sorry, may I ask the panel to speak a little bit more in the microphone?
Forgive me. Sorry, sorry. Forgive me. I'm normally accused of speaking too loudly, so apologies. Well, without recapping, I was just trying to explain the complexities of FPIC in a specific example where essentially a company presented to us the work that they had done to achieve free, prior and informed consent, but actually a little bit of digging around the edges proved to us that actually the free, prior and informed consent didn't extend to the whole community. And then, of course, you get into hugely complicated question of where does truth lie, who's speaking for the community, and all those kinds of questions. And it's very easy at that point to actually throw your hands up and say, I'm confused, I don't know what to do, which is why frequently we work with third parties. I mentioned First Peoples worldwide, but people like Shift, people like Maplecroft, just to try and triangulate and understand better how these complicated issues are being resolved. Are we actually speaking to community representatives that represent the whole community? So there's a huge bunch of complexities in this issue, and I think we need to be, as investors, hugely respectful and listen before we open our mouths. So I'm delighted to be on this panel, and I thought I would just make the point that it's hugely difficult to get this right, and it takes time, and we all have to learn, and we shouldn't just point our fingers at corporations and think we know best, because I imagine the corporations often know their subject matter better than us, because we are doing a whole lot of engagement on other things. So I think it's a sense of humility was the point I wanted to get over, Delaney.
No, thank you very much. Yeah, it's, I mean, I guess ESG and a lot of what we talk about at the PRI is about long-term investing and long-term horizons, and that this is the kind of issue that is very complicated at the outset, but at the same time is so critical to the long term. And so working through to understand that and taking up that challenge is worth it. So you mentioned First Peoples Worldwide, which is an organization that has recently transitioned and is now hosted at their programs are hosted at the University of Colorado, and Carla is deeply involved with that. So Carla, I was wondering if you could give some examples I feel like we've been talking around the issue of like we've been saying Indigenous rights and free prior informed consent, but what is at stake and what are these, why is this important? And so if you could give an example that kind of addresses that.
Sure. Thank you. And thank you all so much for being here. I had a conversation the other day with somebody who said that they don't think they can move the minds of very bad actors, and that they really wanted to engage with people who were sort of in the middle, not really that aware of some of the rights violations, and build that capacity. And I said, well, what about all the people who've been doing good work and have been supportive for a very long time? Because that's really the contingent that's represented here. So I want to say we appreciate you and the support that you've given to these issues over many years, including actually investor support for the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which I think had some small part in getting the United States in particular to sign on to the declaration in 2010. So, as Delaney said, I'm at the University of Colorado. I am a lawyer, law professor, and now I guess I run an NGO too. We took over the work of First Peoples Worldwide when Rebecca Adamson retired a year ago. I've worked with Rebecca for a long time, and one of the most recent engagements that we had together was the corporate engagement strategy on the Dakota Access Pipeline. So since, as I acknowledged, we're in a room of people who probably know a lot about these issues, I don't feel like it's that necessary to really go through a whole lot of specifics about the pipeline, except to say that, of course, before, during, and even after the project, the pipeline faced a really incredible level of community opposition, and in fact helped to galvanize and strengthen the worldwide Indigenous rights movement. So what does that mean, sitting here today for investors? How do people in the position of either managing money that's going to flow to companies, working with lending institutions to ensure that standards are in fact being effectuated on the ground in a reliable way, what on earth are you supposed to look at that situation and think, now what? In response to that, what we've done is a case study on the pipeline. And there have been now a couple of different post-mortem studies on the pipeline that have focused on different things. There's one that came out recently that was more focused on the social movement, and others that have looked at the consultation process in the United States and the contrast between that and free, prior, and informed consent. And in fact, the United States itself and the previous administration actually has started the engagement of a consultation process about consultation. Only here, folks. That's all great, and I think that work needs to be done, but one place where we really saw a gap was in this space, really thinking about the financial impact that happened as a result of the pipeline and the fight against the pipeline on several different levels. What I really want to talk about today is what I think is the cornerstone of the work, which is looking at the impact to the company of the social pressure that was faced during the pipeline fight. So in my former life, I was a securities litigator and a partner at Milberg Weiss, where we did something that we called around our shop bet the company litigation, where we sued companies for financial fraud and misconduct on behalf of institutional investors. And there's a process in those cases that has been sanctioned by the Supreme Court in a case called Halliburton fairly recently, and then confirmed in other cases, that has a methodology called the event study methodology. And what you would do in a securities litigation in the event study methodology is to look at events that happened in company filings, company statements, and things in the press that were publicly available and disseminated that might have an impact on the company's share price. And the reason that you do that in securities litigation is because if you're suing a company for fraud, you have to prove something called loss causation, which is that you purchase the company's stock in reliance of material misstatements or omissions, and then you purchase at an artificially inflated share price. So anybody who's still awake, raise your hand. Okay, thank you. I thought it would be really interesting to apply the event study methodology to the pipeline. Because a lot happened. There was a lot in the news. There were all kinds of statements by the company, both in public filings, in open court, in the media, and then there were dueling statements by the tribe, by the activists, by the investor community, et cetera. And there was just a lot of information in the market. So we looked at the company's share price over the period of time, and we made some really interesting discoveries. One thing that we discovered is, and we want to acknowledge at the outset, is that this is a pipeline company. So pipelines and natural resource equities in the extractive sector are necessarily a bit volatile. And they're volatile in part because of extant factors like geopolitics and oil commodity prices and so on and so forth. And so one thing that we thought going into this was, well, we may see some fluctuation in the share price, but it may not actually be attributable to events, because this was also a period where there was a tremendous amount of fluctuation in those markets. Well, in fact, when we have run now the share price of ETP against the Natural Resources Index, against the S&P 500, and against the Pipeline Index, ETP underperforms over and over again in response to events that happened with the pipeline. So what we're trying to really show, and I think this is super interesting not just for the Indigenous rights lens, but also human rights generally, and especially on social, is to show that social is material. And we've actually named our case study Social Costs and Material Loss. We'll talk a little bit, if we have time, about this idea of salience and the UNGPs and all of that, and I think that's all important. But again, back to my initial statement about how do we get movement in viewpoint, movement that maybe isn't necessarily attached to values. There is real risk here. And I think that because of that, this whole conversation needs to be elevated into that space in a really specific way, where it's not about, I'm so grateful to be here as part of this panel, but as you know, one of the few or only Indigenous people in the room, the language about safeguarding and the language about, Indigenous peoples, it kind of like puts us over here. And there's a whole other conversation happening here. And I think that this issue really needs to be front and center in that conversation, because what you are talking about is risk. We have been able to show now, I think with a degree of specificity and accuracy that I feel really comfortable with, because I'm just terrified the ETP is going to sue us. This is a real thing, and this is something that I think could stand up in the securities litigation context. So that's why I'm here talking about this, and that's why we're engaged in this work. Now, we also, of course, are putting into the study costs to the banks, because obviously in that situation, many of you actually in this room, some people who I can literally see right now, helped to advocate for Indigenous rights with the lending institutions. And we all discovered in the midst of that the banks did not have the right type of safeguards in place in their contracts in the master limited partnership to be able to exit when it became apparent that actually the due diligence just wasn't there on social. And so there's a whole resulting activity that's happening from that about banks looking at their internal processes. The Equator Principles now is engaged in a potential rewrite review process about free, prior, and informed consent that's being led by the banks because they see the risk. We also have a section on costs to community, which is not just the tribal community, but also the surrounding state community as well as the governments, because 16,000 people descending on a rural Indian reservation had some pretty serious impacts, including financial impacts. So I'm running out of time. If you would like to talk more about the case study, it's coming out in about 2 weeks. So we'll distribute it far and wide. And then we're also including, because we inherited First Peoples Worldwide, and because the core of the work of that organization that we really want to honor is connection to community and building capacity within community, we're also including a multimedia presentation that can be disseminated to community, and particularly youth, to help them understand how to best engage in these processes.
Thanks, that was interesting. And yeah, the Dakota Access Pipeline has been very much a galvanizing point for this issue, and that putting the materiality forward. Drawing on that, I wanted to get others' perspectives around the idea of risk and materiality, and kind of why that you've decided that this is something that needs to be dealt with, and what the implications are for your companies and organizations. Does anyone?
So I think it's giving me okay. So I think, when you hear the stories, it is so clear how these are material issues to organizations, and as investors, that's meaningful data to consume. And then we couple that with our belief that corporations have a responsibility to add value to society and the planet, not just detract what they can in pursuit of profit. Our first standards related to protecting those rights actually dates back as early as 1999 as a result of our interaction with Rebecca Adamson. So happy to see you taking over that work. And then, really thinking about it across all asset classes, not just those obvious ones like mining, but, as we're discussing here, financial institutions that get caught up in these issues, and forestry products, and even, consumer products and pharma, where there can sometimes be this concern about privatization of things that are considered, public goods, or other communities having rights to, such as traditional plant, et cetera, are all, important and relevant from not only an obligation of all of us inhabiting this global community together, but as investors, to our clients that we're serving.
Yeah, one thing that hasn't been mentioned that I think it might be useful for this audience as well is that we sort of view this whole question about development and Indigenous rights as a two-sided coin. So on the one side, and that, this is kind of more like the Dakota Access situation that I mentioned, is this question of impact and human rights impacts, and then all of the resulting things that would happen where impact hasn't been properly assessed, considered, where consent hasn't been sought, and so on and so forth. But there are prescriptive aspects to the UN Declaration that I think investors should pay perhaps a bit more attention to, particularly in the area of providing access to capital for self-determined Indigenous projects. So this is a conversation that seems to be picking up a lot of steam, especially as institutional investors and particularly philanthropic investors are looking more to bring their portfolios into a space of impact. And I think that even in the case where there might be an outside project that is seeking to have a positive imprint on or near Indigenous lands or territories, a lot of the work that's been done and some of the work actually that Janina has done is about trying to promote an idea of equity. And that piece is really important. You hear from Indigenous peoples all the time. I was at one of the climate events yesterday about actually renewables, where Indigenous peoples say, well, all of this development is coming at the cost to us and we're not receiving a benefit. And so how do we move the needle on that, and how do we create more beneficial spaces for Indigenous peoples to participate in these projects, either through a shared ownership structure or through real skin in the game? The projects, or even through financing wholly self-determined projects, because that's the other side of this. The outside piece is going to continue to function in various ways, but I think building the piece of self-determined development from within is really crucially important to changing the paradigm on this.
I can follow up on that particularly. I think in the early days of some of our agreements, we probably hadn't really appreciated the importance of that level of participation. We saw it as a payment for ground disturbance. People hadn't the experience in working in mining, what was established in the late 90s in the Pilbara, but we've got experience in our bauxite operations as well. So people actually wanted to be in business, and so how would that happen? Mm-hmm. So looking for a joint venture relationship as a start-up, and historically the business had looked at the Red Dog mine, which has been in operation for 25 years, with the Nana Corporation in Alaska as one of the sort of methodologies that would work. So we've, particularly since the mid-2000s, have been working extensively with Indigenous businesses to grow those business capabilities, and it's taken a lot of work inside the business to learn the capacity to do that. Mm-hmm. So procurement, how procurement goes about fair distribution of opportunities, but recognises that we're working with a group of people who historically have not had access to capital, have not had access to business development because they've been excluded for a whole range of reasons to do with policies of government. And how do we accelerate that? And that has been a really important learning for us and has made a huge difference. So recently, one of our mines in northern Australia is now run by an Indigenous group, a Gawler mine, and they've delivered the first ore to China recently as part of an agreement that we were involved in helping establish that mining operation. So it's a case of building that capacity and looking at what investors can think through in assessing capability inside a company, those conversations around, well, what is being shared value, what is shared business opportunities, how much is the Indigenous participation shown in the business activities, not just in employment but in business, in decision making, through panels, through board membership, and that's certainly one of the conversations happening in Canada, I think being driven by the Canadian Aboriginal Business Association in particular. So that type of opportunity, I think, when investors are looking at what's happening, how tangible is it, and how is that benefit then bringing that shared opportunity for the community so that they're in a position to make decisions in the future as to what they want to do with their land and their relationship with other businesses.
So I guess just before we go to questions, I wanted to touch on what you brought up there about what investors can look for and the investment, in the investment chain. So Share has been doing some work looking within Canada and how this idea of investing in Indigenous businesses and Indigenous partnerships and who in the financial sector and in the investment chain is addressing this and why are they and aren't they? So we've been doing some research in that area. But I think you're right that we need to shift the conversation in part from this, the impacted party, to one of the members of the party. I think when you were speaking, that in my mind it was epitomized by this shift we've seen in the resource sector in particular, from impact benefit agreements, which is you are the impacted party, we are going to compensate you for that impact and you're going to therefore allow us to do our project, to a co-management agreement, which is over the life of the project. This is the arrangement that's set up around co-determination of any key decisions in the life of that project. And that's, I think, a very empowering approach, and that involves the Aboriginal Economic Development Corporations, and it involves many more partners in that process. And so when we're talking to companies, that is something that we look for and we ask about, and we also look for other indicators around contracting and employment and these kind of things. And my last question, I guess, is for Carole and Tim. What kind of indicators do you look for when you're doing the research that you were talked about earlier?
It's a good question, and should be on. And I've slightly lost my train of thought. I think it's much easier to spot the negative indicators. And I can think of one company with which we engaged that had serious problems in this area in its own market, then developed a project in Africa. It's not Rio. And thought that putting up a few houses and then handing out a little bit of cash was enough to secure the viability of the project. How wrong could they be? And what was so interesting was, having had problems in their home market, had learned in their home market how better to interact, to develop agreements with Indigenous peoples in the way that you then thought, we'll go back to our old ways when we went into a different market. Now, whether that was bad faith, insufficient research, insufficient negotiation, it was probably a whole host of different things that led them down a path. But I think the important thing for us is each project is different. Each Indigenous tribe maybe has different aspirations and so on. So you can't just have this plan that you think will work and then adopt it. So it's that appreciation of the local. And if you don't know, then you have to go and find out. And if that means building capacity patiently over time, then that's the first step. It's not starting digging holes in the ground or whatever it is. So it's back to the point I was making before, the complexity and humility, I think actually are two fantastic starting points that we want to hear from companies.
So I think for us, a key consideration there, as we're approaching these issues, we look at the company. You know, do they have policies? Do they disclose them? How do their practices and their history compare with these standards? And what does their due diligence and reporting look like? But we think it's important that we don't stop there, right? So if we only look at this through the company lens, we're going to miss a big piece of it. And I think that gets to Tim's example earlier where, you know, you're there and the company is hosting you and you're seeing and you're getting some responses from the community. But we think it's important for us to not only consider what the company is saying, but what the community is saying. And we'll do research on that and we'll work with other organizations. And then from there, what we consider to be very important is that the company is listening to that voice of the community and responding to it and trying to find resolution. But if there is no resolution, making that appropriate call to withdraw from that project if necessary. So, and there we're looking for that recurring process as we continue to research the process, as we consider to approve or hold those companies and really measure the progress that they're making on those standards.
So one final thing that I wanted to mention that I forgot is that when we come out with the case study, we're actually coming out with a companion piece, which is a free, prior, and informed consent due diligence questionnaire. Because we're trying to develop a toolkit for human rights due diligence for Indigenous peoples that will complement this work. Obviously, people have tried with these free, prior, and informed consent protocols over time to develop like some sort of process. That's not what this is. This is more like a screen. So an investor can use it, a bank can use it, just to make sure that the work that Tim and Carole are describing has actually happened in a way that's consistent with human rights.
Okay, with that, we'll go to questions. I think there's a roving mic. Yes, there is. If anyone has a question, please raise your hand and it will come to you.
Sorry, if I can ask that to everybody in forum, but to Carla, if you would become now President of the United States, yeah, and don't laugh because everybody can become that, seems to be nowadays, but and you would be let's say come up with a plan, yeah, you have a drawing and not a tweet but a real plan, and how would you draw then, let's say in America? I know there are a lot of countries where they have the same issues, but in America, how would you draw then the plan that it is resolving the issues for once and forever, also with Indigenous people, and also with the new people? How would you do that, and what are the first 3 steps?
Carla, I will take another question so you can think about your plan, and then we'll respond.
This president does it in 1 second at the moment.
Because we don't want the tweet version, we want the real version, which gives you a minute to think through. So there was another question at the front. There's 2 actually here. Let's start with the one at the front.
It's a question for Janina, and probably more an opportunity than a question. So Neil Saxton from Hester Superfund in Australia. Now, Rio in Australia has a reconciliation action plan, as does Hester. I wondered if you were able to talk a little bit more about what that means for Rio as far as having a reconciliation action plan, and then what impact that's had on the business, but also your closer connection with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples.
Happy to respond. So we have a reconciliation action plan because in Australia the Reconciliation Council was established as part of response to what was then called the Stolen Generation Report, again similar to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada. That Reconciliation Action Plan actually gathered together a number of our existing partnership or participation agreements, if you like. So to some extent, it came after the work rather than as a forerunner. Other companies have used the Reconciliation Action Plan as a means of making public their commitments to change behaviours inside the company and ensure that the company is more inclusive and recognises both traditional people, the First Peoples of the country, but also working on business and employment opportunities and outcomes. What has happened as a result of our Reconciliation Action Plan is that there's then a question of what we were doing elsewhere in our operations. So particularly in Canada, and I've been working on that in the last few months, the outcomes from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, how are we responding to Action 92, how is that being developed? We have, we've had for a number of years an Indigenous strategy and action plan. We haven't got a similar sort of public document in Canada yet, but I suspect that might come as part of the work that the government and First Nations are undertaking across Canada. However, the work is to ensure that there's a consistency about the way in which we're operating, and so that's part of our public engagement, but also with the First Nations groups and Métis and Innu that we're working with, that they can see that this is part of the commitment, that we're recognising, respecting and seeking reconciliation, which is going through understanding the history and knowledge of the relationships that have existed in Canada. So that's the application that we've taken out of that Reconciliation Action process.
Your plan for presidency?
Well, I'm very flattered and maybe a little frightened by your question. So I think the blueprint is there. I think that, I don't know how many of you have actually sat down and just read the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I think that, we can kind of get really deep into the process and then sort of lose what's already right there in front of us. So the UN Declaration sometimes gets, I think, wrongly described as a document that has a bunch of prohibitions in it. And I really see it as a prescriptive document that really expresses the human rights of Indigenous peoples as an alternative to the realities and legal regimes of colonization. So I think the real question is, how do we implement the UN Declaration domestically? When I had opportunity to talk to the Equator Principles Association over the summer as part of their review process, we kept getting pulled back to this idea of reliance on local law or domestic law. And I finally just said, there's no point really in talking about human rights if that's going to be the fallback. Human rights are supposed to really exist as the true north, as the standard, and anything that's less than that, I think investors really have an opportunity to push implementation toward the human rights standards. And I also think, we're talking about Indigenous rights, and I think I alluded to this before. There's some really interesting lessons in this space that not only, I think, propel this conversation into the larger conversation about risk and about corporate accountability and governance and climate and environment, but also about really the values around decision making and effects on communities of development. And I hope that the work that we're doing and the work that all of you do is more cross-cutting in that regard, because Indigenous people don't exactly possess exceptional rights. The rights that are expressed in the UN Declaration are expressed in that way to try to address the legacy of colonization. But the rights that we all have to have a clean environment, to have say in the development in our communities, and to preserve our ability to pursue joy and happiness are the same. And so as you continue in your work, I guess that's kind of the lens through which I would look at it. But I am not, at this time, running for president.
You got an endorsement. I think that's a good place to stop. I know there was maybe a few more questions, so if you don't want to ask more questions of the panelists, I think we're going to head out to the side there. There's a hallway there that you can join us and continue the conversation. And otherwise, the next sessions start in 5 or 10 minutes.